What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
You know how they say you can live with someone, laugh with someone, even love someone, and still not really know who they are? That's exactly what happened to me. His name was Eli, and when I met him, I wasn't looking for anyone. I wasn't lonely or broken or desperate for a second chance at love. I was just curious. Curious what it would feel like to let someone in again after so many years of being fine on my own. He was 10 years younger, all charm and crooked grins, the kind of man who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket and into your bed without missing a beat. I should have known. But at the time, I told myself I deserved a little fun. It wasn't like I was naive. I'd been through enough to recognize red flags when they waved in front of my face. And Eli? He didn't exactly wave them. He tucked them neatly behind his back, where I couldn't quite see, but I could feel something was off. Still, I let it slide. I was 47, successful, running my own business, and after years of waking up alone in a house that echoed with memories, it was nice to wake up to someone who made breakfast, even if he used every damn pan in the kitchen and never cleaned up after himself. He had that easy confidence some men wear like cologne. It fades fast, but it smells good at first. The only thing I kept separate, the one thing I never shared, was the car. Not just any car. A 1968 Mustang Fastback, cherry red with black leather seats, restored from the frame-up over 4 long, greasy, beautiful years. It had belonged to my dad. We rebuilt it together when I was in high school, weekends spent in the garage, arms elbow-deep in engine grease, swearing and laughing and listening to classic rock while he taught me how to fix things most girls my age didn't even know how to pronounce. That car was more than metal and wheels. It was my father's hands, his smell, his voice calling me kiddo while handing me a socket wrench. After he passed, I couldn't drive it for almost a year. I'd just sit in it with the garage door open, hand on the wheel, remembering him like he was still riding shotgun. I told Eli about it early on, casually at first, just mentioning the car when we talked about our dads. He was interested, or acted like it. He'd peek under the hood, ask questions, compliment the paint job. I noticed how he always steered the conversation back to speed and horsepower, not legacy and memory, but I brushed it off. Men talk about cars like toys, women talk about them like time machines. That's just how it is. And then, 3 months ago, he asked to drive it. We were standing in the driveway. He had just washed it, his idea of being helpful. I watched him wipe it down with a microfiber towel like he knew what he was doing, but all I saw was the way his rings scratched the clear coat. He turned to me, towel still in hand, and grinned. "Come on," he said. "Let me take her around the block." It was the first time he'd ever asked. And I'll be honest, I hesitated. Not out of mistrust, but out of instinct. That car wasn't just a car. It was sacred. But then he gave me that look, you know the one, the look that says, "I care about this because you do," and I thought, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe letting him drive it is a sign that I trust him. That I'm not holding back. I handed him the keys. God, I wish I hadn't. He got in like he belonged there, adjusted the seat, revved the engine harder than necessary, and gave me a wink through the window. I smiled, tight-lipped. Watched the taillights disappear down the street. The sound of the engine was familiar and wrong at the same time, like hearing someone else say your childhood nickname. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I called. No answer. I started pacing the driveway, phone in hand, dread curling in my gut. Every possible explanation ran through my mind. Maybe he stopped to get gas. Maybe he ran into a friend. Maybe the damn thing stalled, even though it never did. And then my phone rang. It wasn't Eli. It was a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, calm and official. "Ma'am, we need you to come to the intersection of Hillcrest and Vale. There's been an accident involving your vehicle." My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might throw up. When I got there, the scene looked like something out of a nightmare. The Mustang was crumpled against a utility pole, the front end smashed in, smoke still rising from under the hood. It didn't look like a car anymore. It looked like a crime scene. Eli was sitting on the curb, arms crossed, completely unbothered. No limp, no blood, not even a scratch. A police officer stood near him, writing something on a pad. When he saw me, Eli waved, like we were at a barbecue. I didn't say a word, just stared at the wreckage. He walked up, casually chewing gum, and said, "At least you weren't in it. I mean, it sucks, but you can afford another one, right?" That's what he said. You can afford another one. Right then, something shifted in me. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was stunned. I felt like the ground had opened beneath me. Like I had handed someone a piece of my father and watched them throw it into a shredder without blinking. I looked at the twisted wreckage, the hood folded like paper, the windshield shattered like broken promises, and I realized two things at once. First, Eli didn't give a damn about me. Not really. And second, I wasn't going to cry, not in front of him, not over this, not yet. I took a breath, clenched my jaw, and nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I can afford another one." But what I really meant was I can afford to wait. Let him think I'd let it go. Let him feel safe. Because sometimes the best revenge starts when the other person thinks they've already won. And I let him think that. For now. There are moments in life that don't just sting, they stay. They embed themselves into the lining of your memory like glass splinters, small but sharp, and no matter how long it's been or how well you think you've moved on, you can still feel the ache when you press just the wrong way. That was the day for me. The day I stood there, gravel crunching under my shoes, the air thick with the smell of coolant and burning rubber, and realized that the man I had trusted, the man I had welcomed into my life, my home, my bed, he wasn't even remotely the man I thought he was. He was a stranger who wore the skin of someone I used to care about. And worst of all, he didn't even say sorry. I remember standing at the edge of the wreck, just staring, frozen. There was this awful silence ringing in my ears even though people were talking all around me, officers asking questions, a bystander explaining what she saw, a paramedic talking to someone in the ambulance, but it was all muffled, like I was underwater. The Mustang, or what was left of it, didn't look like anything that had ever belonged to me. The sleek lines were gone, the metal was bent into unnatural shapes, and the front end looked like it had been punched in by a goddamn fist the size of a building. And Eli? He wasn't even looking at the car. He wasn't kneeling beside it, or pacing in frustration, or even pretending to be upset. He was scrolling through his phone with one leg crossed over the other, like he was waiting for his latte order at Starbucks. It wasn't until the officer approached me and asked if I was the registered owner that I even remembered how to speak. My voice came out thin and mechanical when I confirmed it. The officer glanced back at Eli and then at the damage, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he already knew this was going to be messy, not legally, maybe, but personally. He handed me a clipboard, told me I'd need to follow up with my insurance, and said they'd file an official report. Apparently, Eli had swerved to avoid hitting a raccoon, overcorrected, and slammed into the pole. But the witness, a woman who lived on the corner and had seen the whole thing, said otherwise. She said he was speeding fast enough that the tires squealed when he turned onto Vale, and that he was laughing when the car fishtailed. Laughing. I walked up to him slowly, carefully, like I was approaching a wild animal. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I figured I deserved at least some kind of acknowledgement. He looked up from his phone and gave me that half smirk he always wore when he was trying to downplay something. "Well," he said, standing up and brushing imaginary dust off his jeans, "good news is I'm okay. Bad news is she's not. But hey, you're doing all right, right? You've got a business, you're smart, you'll bounce back. You can afford another one." That sentence, those words, they didn't just land, they detonated. I felt them hit like a slap across the face, like a deliberate erasure of everything that car meant to me, of everything I had shared with him. And in that split second, I understood something important. Eli didn't see that car as history or sentiment or a symbol of a bond between a daughter and her father. He saw it as a toy. A flashy thing to show off in front of people. And now that it was broken, he expected me to shrug, laugh, and move on, like it was no more important than a cracked phone screen. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I just looked at him, really looked, and saw for the first time what had probably been there all along. Eli was the kind of man who only measured value in dollars. He didn't understand things like legacy, like memory, like emotional weight. If it couldn't be replaced with money or a new version, it wasn't worth preserving. That car had never meant anything to him because sentiment was a language he couldn't speak. We rode home in silence. I let him drive his own truck back while I followed the tow truck to the garage. The driver was kind, didn't ask too many questions, just nodded and promised to call me with an estimate, though we both knew what that meant. It was totaled. Unfixable. A loss. I sat in my car for 20 minutes afterward, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to keep myself from shaking. The tears didn't come. Anger would have been easier. Sadness would have made sense. But what I felt was colder than both. I felt nothing. Just a vast, hollow space where something important used to be. When I walked through the front door, Eli was on the couch, feet up, beer in hand, flipping through the channels like he hadn't just destroyed the most irreplaceable object I owned. He looked over at me, raised his bottle, and said, "Hey, babe. You okay now?" I stared at him for a long moment, just long enough for it to get uncomfortable, and then nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. If I had, I might have said something I couldn't take back, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I still needed time to think, to plan, to really understand what I was dealing with. But deep down, I already knew. Eli wasn't sorry. And if he wasn't sorry, then he wouldn't see it coming when I decided to stop being sorry too. Because the thing about people like him, people who take and break and shrug it off, is that they always assume you're too emotional, too forgiving, too soft to strike back. They count on your silence. They count on your restraint. They never expect you to be the one holding the match when everything starts to burn. And the worst part? He had no idea how many things I knew that he'd forgotten I ever heard. He had no idea that I wasn't just hurt. I was done. And that's when the real thinking started. People always imagine betrayal as some single, defining moment, a scream, a broken glass, a dramatic revelation dropped like a bomb at the dinner table, but in reality, it rarely happens that way. Sometimes, betrayal is quieter, slower, like a crack in your windshield that starts small, barely noticeable, until one hot afternoon, it spreads across the glass like a spiderweb, and suddenly you can't unsee it. That's how it began for me, not with a shout, but with a subtle shift in the way Eli looked at me after he crashed that car, with the way he stopped pretending to care once he thought I'd accepted it, once he assumed the story was over and I was too sentimental to hold a grudge. But the truth was, I hadn't even started writing the second act yet. In the days that followed the accident, Eli acted like nothing had happened. He went about his business, as if he hadn't destroyed the most personal thing I owned, and followed it up with the emotional equivalent of shrugging off a funeral. He cooked dinner twice that week, as if that made it better, made it equal, as if overcooked chicken and a few glasses of wine could make me forget the way he had stood there on that curb, barely masking his annoyance at being inconvenienced. He touched my back when I walked by, laughed at his own jokes louder than usual, and told me on more than one occasion that it's just a car, as if repeating it would make it true, as if repetition could bleach out significance. But the more normal he acted, the more abnormal it felt. Something had shifted between us, and while he was too arrogant to notice it, I saw everything differently now. I watched him more closely. I listened more carefully. I started keeping mental notes in a way I hadn't before, not because I was paranoid, but because my instincts, which I had stupidly ignored for months, were finally screaming loud enough to be heard. There were things that hadn't made sense before, little inconsistencies I had waved away because I was trying to be understanding. But now, without the blinders of affection, the puzzle pieces began falling into place in a way that made my stomach turn. It started with the insurance claim. I hadn't planned to dive into it myself at first. I just wanted to know what the process would be, whether anything at all could be salvaged. But when I asked him what he told the adjuster, he got cagey. Said it was handled, said I didn't need to stress about it, and that they'll probably just send a check. But when the paperwork arrived at the house and I read through it, every line, every checkbox, every casually fraudulent lie, I realized that Eli had not only told the adjuster that I gave him verbal permission to take the car out for a spin, but also that I'd been drinking that night, and he was helping me out by running an errand in my place. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his soft snoring beside me, thinking about how easily those words had rolled off his tongue, how confidently he had rewritten the truth to protect himself at my expense, even if it meant suggesting I was negligent, irresponsible, or worse. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was an active decision to place blame on me, knowing full well that if this ever reached a courtroom or an insurance hearing, it would be my name, not his, that came under fire. And the worst part? He knew I'd find it eventually. He just didn't think I'd do anything about it. That was the moment everything changed. I stopped being a woman who had been hurt by a reckless man and became someone calculating, someone careful, someone who understood that the best kind of revenge doesn't happen in the heat of the moment. It brews in silence, beneath the surface, while the other person is busy believing they've gotten away with it. The next morning, I pulled out an old spiral notebook and started writing. Not diary entries or emotional monologues. I wasn't interested in processing feelings. I was documenting facts. Times. Dates. Quotes. Patterns. Every instance where Eli had lied, manipulated, or twisted the truth. Every conversation where he casually dropped a name or bragged about someone he knew in a way that didn't sit right with me. I started with the accident, but I didn't stop there. Because once I opened my eyes, I saw that this wasn't just about the car. Eli had lied about his job, at least partially. He said he was in mid-level management at a tech consulting firm, but I'd never once seen him take a business call that wasn't on speaker, and his hours never made sense. He'd disappear in the middle of the day for client meetings that somehow never required a suit, a laptop, or any actual paperwork. I remembered a night, maybe 2 months into dating, when he had told me he used to work for a defense contractor, but left because it was too corporate, and then a few weeks later, said something completely different about working in logistics for a government subcontractor. At the time, I didn't press. I thought it was just bad memory or a throwaway comment. But now, those contradictions hit differently. So I did what any woman in my position would do, what any woman with a history in corporate compliance and a Rolodex full of former colleagues would do. I made a few calls. Quiet, careful calls. I didn't ask direct questions. I just reached out to people I used to work with back in the day, people who had moved on to bigger companies, and mentioned that my boyfriend had recently joined a firm they might know. I kept it casual. But the responses were illuminating. Not only did none of them recognize his name, but one of them, Laura, an old contact who now handled HR investigations for a defense technology firm, froze when I mentioned the company Eli said he worked for. She paused and asked me to spell his name again. When I did, she went quiet for a moment and said, "You should check the public registry. There's something there. I'm not supposed to say more, but just check." That night, I looked him up. And what I found wasn't criminal, exactly, but it was enough to paint a very different picture of Eli than the one he presented. Several court filings from previous civil disputes. A couple of liens. A former landlord suing for damages on a luxury apartment. And tucked quietly into the corner of one case file, an ex-girlfriend's testimony, submitted as part of a restraining order request, detailing how Eli had a pattern of manipulating older women, living off them until things got tense, and then leaving suddenly, often after doing something he could frame as an accident. Suddenly, the crash didn't feel accidental at all. Suddenly, I wasn't just a woman grieving a wrecked car, I was another line in his pattern. Another mark. Another target. But I wasn't going to be a victim. Because what Eli didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the moment he forged that police report, the moment he tried to smear me to cover his own reckless ass, he stepped into territory I had spent over a decade learning to navigate. He walked right into the one area of life where I had experience, connections, and no reason to hold back. Eli forgot who I am. More importantly, Eli forgot who I used to work for. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. There's a certain art to pretending, an elegance, almost, to walking through your own home like nothing's changed while every cell in your body is vibrating with a quiet, seething rage you've learned how to disguise beneath practiced smiles and perfectly timed nods. It's a performance, really, and by the time the curtain falls, you realize you've become so good at pretending that even the person who knows your bed, your schedule, and your fridge layout has no clue that you're standing 10 feet away, planning the end of their carefully constructed house of cards. That's what the days started to feel like after I found out who Eli really was, not days in the traditional sense, but scenes, each one carefully choreographed so I could buy myself time, gather information, and most importantly, make him feel like he'd won. Because once someone believes they're safe, that's when they stop paying attention, and a man who isn't paying attention is the easiest target of all. I began my mornings the same way I always had: coffee brewed strong, emails opened by 7, the soft hum of my phone buzzing with client messages and calendar alerts. But beneath the surface of that routine was a new rhythm. One guided not by to-do lists or project deadlines, but by what I had come to think of as quiet warfare. I still kissed him goodbye. I still asked if he needed anything while I was out. I even laughed at his lazy jokes during dinner and let him think I was slowly softening, healing, maybe even moving on from what had happened. And through it all, he never once apologized, never once took real responsibility for destroying that car, or for lying to the insurance company, or for what I now realized was a carefully layered deception from the very first day we met. He thought the silence meant forgiveness. He didn't understand that it was a countdown. The thing about revenge is that it requires patience, not the emotional kind, but the strategic kind, the kind that forces you to sit still even when your gut is screaming to act, because you know that if you wait just a little longer, the opportunity will be so clean, so surgical, that they'll never see it coming. And I had waited long enough. I knew Eli's patterns. I knew when he left for the gym, when he called his mother, when he logged on to his company meetings, which, more often than not, were just him watching stock videos and clicking around spreadsheets he didn't understand. I also knew the name of the woman who had processed my old HR reports when I worked for a major consulting firm back in San Jose. Her name was Marnie, and the last time I saw her, she was sharp as ever and about one promotion away from running her entire department. I hadn't spoken to her in over 6 years, but when I sent her a polite message on LinkedIn asking if she'd be open to reconnecting for lunch, she replied within 10 minutes and asked what day worked best. We met at a little Mediterranean place halfway between our neighborhoods, and when I walked in, she was already sitting there, sipping sparkling water and reading something on her phone. The moment she looked up, I saw her expression change, something between curiosity and recognition. We hugged, exchanged pleasantries, and ordered like we were just two old friends catching up. But once the plates hit the table, I slid a manila envelope across the wood and leaned in. "I need this to go to the right department," I said, keeping my voice low but steady. No names involved, just eyes on the facts. Marnie didn't ask why. She opened the envelope, read through the police report, the insurance claim, the copy of the recorded witness statement I'd managed to obtain, and the page of notes I'd typed out detailing Eli's conflicting job history, his potential misuse of employer resources, and his previous civil filings. Her face didn't change much, but her fingers tapped the table in that rhythmic way that told me her mind was already working through the implications. She set the envelope down, folded her hands neatly in front of her, and said, "You want this to come from inside?" I nodded once slowly. "And if this triggers a review? I'm counting on it." She gave a small smile, not cold, but certainly not warm, and told me she'd handle it discreetly. That was all I needed. I paid the bill and left with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Back home, Eli was lounging on the back deck with a glass of scotch, feet kicked up, sunglasses on, completely oblivious. He turned when I came out, raised his glass like we were in some kind of celebration, and said, "Told you it'd all blow over. That shop guy called. He said they might be able to part it out. Maybe you can buy something newer, faster, huh?" It took everything I had not to let my face betray the flood of disgust rising in my throat. But I smiled, God, I smiled so well I scared myself a little, and walked over to him, sat down in the chair beside him, and clinked my water glass against his. "Maybe I will," I said, tilting my head just slightly. "Or maybe I'll wait and see what turns up." He laughed, called me cryptic, and turned back toward the sunset like he was starring in his own personal movie. That's the thing about narcissists. They always think they're the lead. They never realize when the story has started turning without them, when they've become the villain in someone else's plot. And Eli? He had no idea the credits were already rolling on his part. For the next 2 days, I did nothing. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I even helped Eli write a cover letter for a new internal position he was applying for, knowing full well that his entire department was about to be under scrutiny. The only clue he got that something might be off was when his boss, David, someone I'd only met once at a holiday event, called him out of the blue and said there was an issue with one of his past submissions. I watched Eli's face twist in confusion, then defensiveness, and finally suspicion. But he played it off, said he'd get to the bottom of it, and hung up without much more than a shrug. That night, he drank a little more than usual. I heard the hesitation in his voice when he asked if I thought something weird was going on. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about and reminded him, sweetly, that things always feel a little off after a crash. You just get rattled, that's all. He bought it. Or at least, he acted like he did. He poured himself another drink and spent the evening texting someone I didn't recognize, but I didn't bother to ask. I didn't need to anymore. He was unraveling all on his own. What he didn't know was that by the time that manila envelope reached Marnie's office, it had already been digitally logged, time-stamped, and marked for internal review. And what he really didn't know was that the copy I'd kept, the one with all the extra notes, the ones I hadn't given to Marnie, was sitting in a password-protected folder on my laptop, ready to be forwarded to every ethics and compliance contact in his company if he so much as breathed wrong. I had smiled while I loaded the gun. Now, all I had to do was wait for the trigger to pull itself. There's something deeply satisfying, disturbingly so, even in watching a man built on lies finally choke on the very script he wrote for himself, especially when he doesn't even realize he's doing it. When he walks around like a king whose throne has already been sold off, piece by piece, behind his back, while he keeps giving orders to people who've stopped listening. That was Eli in those final days. Comfortable, confident, still basking in his imagined invincibility, still convinced that the world would bend around his mistakes the same way it always had, that people would keep excusing him, that consequences were always someone else's burden. And me? I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was patient, razor-sharp, and composed in a way I hadn't been since this entire mess started, because when you know the storm is coming, but you're the one who scheduled it, the rain doesn't scare you. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after 8:30, when Eli was still in the kitchen, stirring his coffee like it was just another day, when the first real sign arrived, not with drama or volume, but with a single email notification that popped up on his phone as he scrolled absent-mindedly, waiting for the toast to pop. I watched him from the other side of the room, holding my own mug, pretending to read the news on my tablet while my eyes were quietly fixed on the subtle changes in his face, the quick narrowing of his eyes, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his shoulders dropped just enough to signal that whatever he was reading wasn't what he expected. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the screen for a few extra seconds, then locked the phone, set it down too carefully, and took a sip of his coffee with forced casualness. But I could see it. That tiny fracture in the illusion. That first tremor before the whole thing started to give way. I waited. I said nothing. Just sat there, sipping, watching, letting him breathe in the discomfort I'd been drowning in for weeks. About 10 minutes later, he got up, mumbled something about needing to check on a few things, and walked into the spare room we had turned into his home office, which until now had mostly been used to take the occasional Zoom call and store unopened Amazon boxes. The door didn't close all the way, and from my seat at the table, I could hear him clicking around on his laptop, pacing, typing fast, muttering under his breath. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew exactly what he was reading. The audit report had been triggered. Someone in compliance had flagged his last 3 client submissions as inconsistent. Someone else had asked why his timesheets didn't align with his expense reports. And someone, buried behind layers of anonymous tip channels, had submitted a detailed report about unethical behavior, personal misuse of company resources, and a falsified statement tied to a police report involving a privately owned vehicle, one that did not belong to him. He came out of the office nearly an hour later, eyes glassy, jaw clenched, and when he saw me, he did that thing people do when they're drowning in confusion, but trying not to show it. He smiled, wide and fake, too many teeth, too much cheer for 8:30 in the morning. "Hey," he said, his voice just a bit too tight. "You ever hear of an internal audit hitting someone out of nowhere? Like, no warning, no heads up." I shrugged, eyes still on my tablet. "Sure," I said, calmly flipping a page I wasn't reading. "Happens when people get lazy. Or sloppy. Or think they're invisible." He laughed, short and strained, then turned away, muttering something about people being out to get him, about internal politics, about enemies in the office. I said nothing, just watched as the man who once stood in my garage, revving the engine of a car he didn't understand, slowly came to terms with the fact that he was no longer the one behind the wheel of anything that mattered. By noon, he was pacing. By 2, he was drinking. And by 5, he was officially locked out of his company email, locked out of internal systems, and sent a formal notice that he had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. He stared at the screen in disbelief, fingers hovering over the keyboard like maybe, just maybe, this was a mistake, and if he typed fast enough, called enough people, offered just the right excuse, he could fix it. But there was no fixing this. There was no spin that would work on a department built to detect bullshit. When he finally turned to me, hours later, eyes bloodshot, voice shaking somewhere between anger and fear, all he could muster was, "Did you have something to do with this?" I met his gaze without blinking, without softening, without any trace of the woman he thought would always protect him, and I said, "You lied. You made me the villain in your little story, and you thought I wouldn't notice. Worse, you thought I wouldn't respond." He stared at me, mouth slightly open, like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he really had convinced himself that I was just a backdrop in his performance, that I was there to cheer him on, pick up the pieces, and smile through the damage. I stood up slowly, walked past him, and paused at the hallway, not turning back, not giving him the dignity of eye contact. "You once said I could afford another one," I said, voice low and deliberate. "But here's the truth, Eli, I can afford a lot of things, including watching you lose everything you lied to keep." The silence that followed was thick, unbearable even to him. He didn't chase after me. He didn't yell. He didn't even try to explain. For the first time since I'd known him, Eli had nothing to say. That night, he packed a bag. He didn't tell me where he was going, and I didn't ask. He left behind the scotch, the watch I bought him for his birthday, and a file folder I didn't open but knew contained whatever desperate pieces of his past he thought were still worth clinging to. The next morning, I walked into the garage, turned on the light, and stood there staring at the empty spot where the Mustang used to sit. It was just a slab of concrete now, dust-streaked and quiet, but I didn't feel lost, not anymore. I felt resolve. I felt like the silence in that garage wasn't grief, it was a clean slate. He had taken something from me that could never be replaced. So I took something from him that he never imagined losing. He woke up unemployed. But that was only the beginning. Because the thing about people like Eli is they don't understand the difference between forgiveness and distance. They think if you're not screaming, you're not serious. They think silence means surrender. But I wasn't silent. I was strategic. And he'll spend the rest of his life trying to figure out how I stayed so calm, so quiet, so polite, while I slowly burned down the very foundation of the little empire he built on charm and bullshit. Let him wonder. Let him stew in it. Because the truth? He thought I lost a car. But what I really lost was any reason to keep him safe.